By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a moment of quiet desperation. For nearly 4 years, the sea lanes between North America and Britain had become the most dangerous battlefield of the war, an invisible front where survival depended not on tanks or air cover, but on endurance, discipline, and sound. On March 17, 1943, convoy HX-229 pushed eastward through the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles south of Iceland. 41 merchant vessels advanced in tight columns, their steel hulls rising and falling in 15-foot swells, decks slick with freezing spray. The ships carried more than 140,000 tons of cargo: grain, fuel oil, spare aircraft engines, artillery shells. These were not supplies for future offensives. They were necessities. Without them, Britain would not last the year. Life aboard the convoy was tense and monotonous. Crews slept in short shifts, fully clothed. Boots stayed on. Life jackets were kept within arm's reach. The men knew the statistics. Merchant sailors had a lower survival rate than infantrymen on the Eastern Front. Torpedoes gave no warning. A ship could be gone in under 2 minutes. On the bridge of one of those ships, a standard American Liberty ship, the officer of the watch scanned the dark horizon with binoculars that offered little comfort. There were no lights. No radio transmissions. Silence was survival. Every man aboard understood that somewhere below the surface, German submarines were listening. Beneath the waves, that understanding was mutual. At depths of nearly 400 feet, German Type 7 U-boats moved slowly, conserving battery power. Their diesel engines were shut down. Inside the control rooms, the air was stale, heavy with fuel fumes and sweat. Men spoke in whispers. Boots were removed to reduce noise. The most important man aboard was not the captain, but the hydrophone operator. German hydrophones were passive listening devices, exquisitely sensitive. A skilled operator could distinguish the low-frequency rumble of merchant ship engines from dozens of miles away. Each convoy announced itself long before it could be seen. The rhythmic pulse of propellers, the vibration of machinery transmitted through steel hulls into seawater, it all carried. To a U-boat commander, it was as unmistakable as footsteps in a hallway. By mid-March, German wolf packs were at their peak. Dozens of submarines were deployed in overlapping patrol lines, coordinated by radio until contact was made. Once a convoy was detected, transmissions ceased. The submarines simply listened, maneuvered, and waited. What followed HX-229 was not a single attack, but a sustained hunt. Over the next 6 days, merchant ships were struck one by one. Torpedoes hit at night, often from the surface. Explosions were brief and brutal, followed by the sound that haunted survivors most: the rush of water into steel compartments, the groan of twisting hulls, then silence. By the end of the engagement, 22 ships from convoys HX-229 and SC-122 had been sunk. More than 300 merchant sailors were lost to the freezing Atlantic. It was one of the worst convoy disasters of the war. In Berlin, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, called it a triumph. The numbers supported him. In March 1943 alone, German submarines sank over 567,000 tons of Allied shipping, more than any other month of the war. In London, the figures were classified. Britain imported nearly 2/3 of its food and all of its petroleum by sea. At current loss rates, the country had less than 3 months of reserves. The margin for error was gone. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Not invasion. Not bombing. The sea. Because at sea the Allies were losing. And the reason was not courage. It was not a lack of ships. It was not even tactics. It was sound. Every merchant vessel was effectively broadcasting its position across the ocean. Allied escorts had sonar, early ASTIC systems, but these worked only in narrow arcs and failed completely against surface submarines at night. High-frequency radio direction finding could track U-boats when they transmitted, but once contact was made, the submarines went silent. The convoys could not. The ocean carried their noise farther than anyone had once believed possible. And in March 1943, while admirals argued and scientists reached grim conclusions, aboard one of those merchant ships, far from command rooms and conference tables, a single man was listening more closely than anyone else. He was not an officer. He carried no rank. And no one had asked for his opinion. He worked in the galley. Thomas Patrick Lawson was 28 years old, officially listed as ship's cook, U.S. Merchant Marine. Nothing in his service record suggested innovation, bravery, or leadership. His papers described him as adequate, His duties confined to feeding 40-odd men 3 times a day in a galley that never quite stopped moving. Lawson had grown up in South Boston, born in 1915, the second of 5 children in a family that learned early how to stretch little into enough. He left school at 14 during the Depression and never went back. Cooking was not a calling, it was survival. Diners, boarding houses, coastal freighters, anywhere a man could work with his hands and be paid in cash. When war came, the merchant marine offered $125 a month, triple what he earned ashore. The danger was known, but so was the need. Lawson signed on without ceremony. A Liberty ship was no place of comfort. Built for speed of production, not longevity, the William Eustis vibrated constantly. Rivets groaned. Pipes rattled. The engine room ran hot and loud, the steam turbines hammering away hour after hour. Men communicated with hand signals because voices were useless. Most sailors avoided the engine spaces when off watch. Lawson did the opposite. After meals were served and the galley cleaned, he went below. He sat on overturned crates near the bulkheads, sometimes for hours, just listening. It unsettled the crew. First mate Robert Chin, a veteran of 2 sinkings, warned him more than once. "That's how men die," Chin told him. "You don't hear the alarm. You don't get out in time." Lawson shrugged. He wasn't reckless. He was curious. Cooking had trained his senses in ways no one thought valuable. He could tell when bread would burn by smell alone. He could hear when a pot was about to boil over without looking. In the engine room he began to recognize patterns. The higher whine of the turbine under load. The deep, rhythmic shudder of the propeller shaft. The way vibration traveled through steel into his boots. It was not noise to him. It was structure. On February 19, 1943, during convoy SC-118, that structure broke. Shortly after midnight, klaxons sounded. The convoy had been found. Men ran to stations as the ship zigzagged, its escorts firing star shells into the darkness. Lawson was already below, crouched near the main steam line when a torpedo struck a ship 2 columns to port. He did not hear the explosion first. He felt it. A distant, dull concussion, then something else. A strange, hollow booming that resonated through the water and the hull at the same time. The sound deepened, stretched, then faded into an absence so complete it was unnerving. Silence. The ship that had been there moments before was no longer making noise at all. Lawson stared at the bulkhead, his heart pounding. Around him, the William Eustis still thundered forward, engines roaring, propeller churning. But somewhere nearby, a vessel had transitioned from loud to silent in seconds. He grabbed Donald MacLeod, the chief engineer, a Scotsman with 20 years at sea. "Did you hear that?" Lawson shouted. MacLeod wiped grease from his hands. "Hear what? A ship getting blown to hell?" "No," Lawson said. "After. When it filled. It went quiet. Completely quiet." MacLeod shook him off. "That's because it sank. Get out of my space." But Lawson couldn't forget it. The sound hadn't just stopped, it had been smothered. The water itself had absorbed it. The machinery vibrations, the resonance of steel, gone. For the rest of the crossing, Lawson carried a cheap notebook in his jacket. In it, he drew rough sketches during spare moments. Pipes, shafts, tanks. He wasn't designing ships. He was remembering plumbing. Water heaters. Pressure lines. Ballast tanks. He understood one thing clearly: water stopped vibration. He showed the drawings to MacLeod. The engineer didn't look. He showed them to the first mate, who laughed. He finally showed them to Captain James Bannerman, exhausted and gray-faced from weeks of losses. "Son," Bannerman said gently, "leave this to men who've studied it." Lawson nodded and left the bridge. But the idea stayed. When the William Eustis reached Liverpool on March 24, the crew was granted shore leave. Most headed for pubs or sleep. Lawson washed, put on his clean uniform, and walked straight to Western Approach's command headquarters. He did not have an appointment. He was stopped at the door by Royal Navy Shore Patrol and told, firmly, to leave. He insisted. He mentioned convoy noise. He said he had an idea. They took him by the arm. Before he could be removed, a voice cut across the lobby. "Wait." Commander Peter Gretton, Royal Navy, had just returned from Convoy ONS 5, where he had lost 13 ships in a single battle. He was thin, unshaven, and visibly exhausted. "What did you say?" Gretton asked. Lawson spoke quickly, clumsily, but with urgency. He described the engine room. The sinking ship. The silence. Water-absorbing vibration. Controlled flooding, sealed chambers, not the hull itself. Gretton listened without interrupting. When Lawson finished, Gretton said flatly, "That sounds ridiculous." Then he paused. And if it isn't? Gretton had spent 2 years watching his ships die while experts told him nothing more could be done. He was not looking for elegance. He was looking for survival. Come with me, he said. Commander Peter Gretton did not bring Thomas Lawson to an admiral. He brought him to a dockyard. The Flower-class corvette HMS Sunflower sat in dry dock at Liverpool, her hull scarred from months of Atlantic escort duty. She displaced just over 900 tons, armed with a 4-inch gun forward, depth charge rails aft, and a Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar mounted on the forecastle. She was slow, cramped, and notoriously uncomfortable, but she was available. If your idea is nonsense, Gretton told Lawson quietly, we'll know quickly. And if it's not, I don't intend to ask permission to find out. The chief engineer, Lieutenant James Whitby, was openly hostile. You're letting a cook tamper with my propulsion system, he said. That's not innovation. That's vandalism. Gretton cut him off. 3 days. That's all I'm asking. If it fails, we tear it out and no one ever hears of this. They worked in secrecy mostly at night. Dockyard welders were told only that Gretton had orders for temporary ballast modification. The prototype was crude by any professional standard. Empty oil drums were welded around the propeller shaft housing and filled with seawater. Stacks of sandbags were pressed against engine mounts to simulate the mass of water-filled chambers Lawson had described. It looked wrong. Everyone could see that. On March 28, the Sunflower was towed into the Mersey River for the first test. A Royal Navy submarine, HMS Trespasser, submerged 500 yards away, hydrophones active. Lawson stood on deck, gripping the rail, his hands slick with sweat. Gretton watched the signal lamp. The submarine surfaced. The message was blunt. Engine noise unchanged. Propeller cavitation clearly audible. Failure. Whitby exhaled sharply. Told you. Gretton said nothing. His career had just slipped closer to the edge. Lawson stared at the engine room access. Something felt wrong, not with the idea but the execution. The drums, he said suddenly. They're leaking. Whitby scoffed. They're oil drums. Exactly, Lawson replied. They weren't built to hold pressure long-term. The water drained out. He was right. When inspected, several weld seams were seeping. The chambers were no longer full. Gretton ran a hand through his hair. Unauthorized modifications were one thing. Continuing after a failure was something else entirely. How long? He asked. 3 days, Lawson said. If we seal them properly. Gretton hesitated, then nodded. 3 days. This time they did it correctly. Purpose-built steel chambers were welded tight. Rubberized bladders were fabricated and packed against the engine mounts. Everything was sealed, pressure-tested, and filled with seawater. On April 2, 1943, the Sunflower returned to the river. The submarine submerged. Minutes passed. No signal. 10 minutes. 15. Finally, the Trespasser surfaced. Her captain stood on the conning tower, binoculars raised, not looking at the corvette but at his instruments. Gretton signaled. The reply came back slowly, deliberately. At 400 yards, your acoustic signature vanished. No engine noise. No propeller cavitation distinguishable from background sea state. Lawson closed his eyes and leaned against the rail. Whitby said nothing. The silence was not just on the river. It settled over the men themselves. On April 3, Gretton took the results to London. The boardroom. Admiralty, Whitehall, April 3, 1943. Rear Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, listened in silence as Gretton presented the data. Horton was a veteran submariner from the First World War. He understood sound. So did Dr. Harold Burris, the Admiralty's chief naval architect, who openly dismissed the findings. Water inside a ship compromises stability, Burris argued. It's basic physics. Water in sealed chambers, Lawson corrected quietly. Horton turned to him. Explain it simply. Lawson swallowed. Machinery vibration travels through steel. Steel transfers it to water. But water absorbs vibration better than steel transfers it. If the vibration enters water before it reaches the hull, it doesn't escape. The room argued. Credentials versus results. Finally, Horton stood. Retrofit 6 ships, he ordered. 1 convoy. If it works, we proceed. If it fails, this ends. Gretton exhaled. Lawson realized something then. The test was no longer about being right. It was about time. Convoy on 184. Between April 11th and April 18th, 6 merchant ships were modified in Liverpool, including the William Eustace. The work took 64 hours per ship. Added weight, 18 tons. On April 22, convoy on 184 sailed west, 43 ships, 9 columns, 6 escorts. German wolf packs were already waiting. Contact. April 25, 1943, 0214 hours. Aboard U-264, Captain Lieutenant Hartwig Lux studied his hydrophone readings with growing confusion. Some ships were loud. Others faded inexplicably. It made no tactical sense. Unable to track the entire convoy, Lux made a conservative decision: attack only what he could hear. He never detected the modified ships at all. The result? By April 27, 9 merchant ships had been sunk. None were among the modified 6. When On 184 reached New York on May 7, Gretton sent a single signal to London. Acoustic dampening effective under combat conditions. Aftermath. May 1943 became known in Germany as Black May. U-boat losses surged. Wolfpack coordination collapsed. The Atlantic balance shifted. Thomas Patrick Lawson never received a medal. He returned to the galley. But 4,200 men lived because one cook listened when others did not. The change was not announced. There was no communique, no press release, no shift in doctrine that merchant sailors could read about in newspapers. For the men at sea, the difference announced itself only through absence, through the long, uneasy stretches when nothing happened. In April, convoys had expected contact. By May, something felt different. German U-boats still prowled the shipping lanes, but their attacks came later, closer, and with less coordination. Submarine commanders who had once tracked convoys from dozens of miles away now struggled to establish contact at all. Hydrophone operators reported weak, broken signals, convoy noise that appeared, vanished, then reappeared without explanation. What they did not know was that more ships were quietly becoming acoustically muted. Following the success of On 184, Admiral Horton authorized accelerated installation of the dampening system on every available merchant hull passing through British dockyards. There were no elaborate redesigns. Dockyard crews welded sealed steel chambers around propeller shaft housings. Rubberized water-filled bladders were pressed against engine mounts. Engineers were trained in hours, not weeks. It was not elegant. It was fast. By mid-May, more than 140 merchant vessels had been modified. By June, the number exceeded 700. The effect on German tactics was immediate and devastating. The wolf packs falter. U-boat commanders relied on distance. Their advantage lay in hearing convoys before escorts could detect them. With that advantage gone, submarines were forced to close to within half a nautical mile to establish firm contact. That was fatal. At those ranges, Allied ASTIC could detect submerged targets. Surface search radar picked up periscopes. Escort aircraft, long-range B-24 Liberators fitted with Lee lights, could suddenly find submarines at night. Wolfpack coordination collapsed. Submarines arrived piecemeal instead of en masse. Attacks became isolated. Escorts, no longer overwhelmed, hunted aggressively. Between May 1 and May 31, 1943, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, nearly one-quarter of Germany's operational fleet. German submariners called it Der Schwarze Mai, Black May. German reaction. In Berlin, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz struggled to understand what had changed. His after-action reports were filled with the same phrase: convoy acoustic detection unreliable. New hydrophone calibrations were ordered. Patrol patterns were adjusted. None of it restored the old advantage. U-boats that once stalked unseen were now hunted relentlessly. Survivors reported escorts appearing as if summoned, depth charges walking closer with each pass. On May 24, Donitz made the unthinkable decision. He withdrew the majority of U-boats from the North Atlantic. The battle that had nearly starved Britain into surrender had turned, quietly, without fanfare. Life aboard the silent ships. 4 merchant crews, the change was subtle but unmistakable. Engine rooms felt different. The vibration that once rattled teeth now seemed muffled. Men noticed they could speak without shouting. Tools no longer danced on steel plates. Lawson returned to his duties without ceremony. He supervised installations when ordered, then went back to cooking. His name appeared nowhere in official communiques. Among the crew of the William Eustace, however, the difference was personal. First Mate Chen later recalled that on the ship's next crossing, the usual tension never quite peaked. "We still expected it," he said. But it didn't come the same way. They crossed without a single torpedo sighting. The cost. Victory did not erase loss. Thousands of merchant sailors were already gone. Men who would never know why the Atlantic had suddenly grown quieter. The sea did not return them. Their names were carved later into memorials at Tower Hill and Halifax, often without graves. Nor did the new technology make convoys invulnerable. Ships were still sunk. Men still died. But the numbers shifted decisively. From March to July 1943, Allied shipping losses dropped by more than 80%. U-boat losses increased fourfold. Britain's supply lines held. Recognition. Commander Gretton's career survived, just barely. He received no public commendation for the unauthorized experiment. Admiral Horton ensured the credit remained diffuse, buried in technical memoranda and statistical annexes. As for Thomas Patrick Lawson, he returned to the anonymity of the merchant marine. He was never promoted. He received no medal. His contribution appeared in records only as liquid acoustic dampening modification. A line in a report. A footnote in a war measured in tonnage and attrition. Reflection. Wars are often remembered for their weapons and their generals. The Battle of the Atlantic turned not on a new gun or a bold maneuver, but on a moment of observation, a recognition that water, the very element that drowned ships, could also protect them. The lesson was not about genius. It was about listening. Listening to the sea. Listening to the ship. Listening to a man no one expected to have an answer. In May 1943, the Atlantic fell silent, not because the enemy vanished but because someone finally learned how to stop being heard. After Black May, the war at sea did not end. Convoys still sailed under threat, escorts still dropped depth charges into gray water, and merchant sailors still slept with their boots on. But the nature of the fight had changed. For the first time since 1939, time was on the Allies' side. By June 1943, acoustic dampening installations had become routine. They were not discussed in detail even within the merchant marine. Engineers received brief instructions, drawings stamped restricted, and orders to proceed. The system had no official name aboard ship. Sailors called it the water packs, or simply the quieting. On most vessels, crews noticed the change before they understood it. Engine rooms were less violent. Conversations became possible. The steel no longer seemed to hum constantly beneath their feet. It did not make the sea less frightening, but it made it less predictable for the enemy. Convoys that once lost a quarter of their ships now lost one or two, or none at all. Lawson's place in it. Thomas Patrick Lawson remained aboard the SS William Eustis through the summer of 1943. He crossed the Atlantic 7 more times that year, carrying food west and ammunition east. He was occasionally detached for brief periods to supervise installations on newly arrived ships, but always returned to the galley. His name appeared on no citation lists. The merchant marine was a civilian service. Its men did not qualify for many of the decorations given to uniformed personnel. Innovations that affected thousands of ships were credited to committees, not individuals. Lawson did not protest. According to shipmates, he seemed relieved to fade back into routine. He cooked. He listened. He kept his notebook, though no one ever saw him write in it again. One anecdote survived in a post-war interview with an engineer who sailed with him in late 1944. During a calm crossing, the man asked Lawson if he ever thought about what might have happened if his idea had failed. Lawson considered it for a moment and replied, "Then it would have just been another bad crossing." The war's end. By 1944, the Atlantic convoy system was functioning with an efficiency unimaginable a year earlier. Escort carriers provided air cover. Radar improved. New sonar systems closed detection gaps. German submarines were hunted from the moment they left port. But historians would later note that none of those advances mattered if convoys could be heard from beyond reach. The quieting of merchant ships forced submarines into the open. It turned hunters into prey. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic officially ended. It had been the longest continuous campaign of the war, and the one that determined whether any other victory was possible. After the war, Lawson left the merchant marine in 1946. He returned to Boston married and took work as a cook in a hospital kitchen. He rarely spoke about the war. Like many merchant sailors, he carried no uniform, no medals, and no official veteran status for years afterward. When asked once by a neighbor what he had done during the war, he answered simply, "I cooked." It was not a lie. Only in post-war naval research papers, declassified decades later, did his name appear, briefly, attached to early field observations that led to liquid acoustic dampening. Even then, the credit was shared, diluted, embedded in institutional language. There was no ceremony. No monument. The men who lived. The impact of the change was measured not in recognition but in survival. Between mid-1943 and the end of the war, more than 4,200 merchant sailors crossed the Atlantic aboard ships that would likely have been detected and attacked under earlier conditions. They arrived instead, cold, tired, alive. They unloaded cargo. They wrote letters home. They went on to fight in other wars or live ordinary lives. Most never knew why their luck had changed. Historical perspective. Modern naval historians are cautious in assigning single causes to complex outcomes. The Allied victory at sea was the result of many factors: air coverage, intelligence, industrial capacity, and training. But timing matters. Acoustic dampening did not win the war by itself. It arrived at the moment when loss rates were unsustainable and options were exhausted. It bought time. And in war, time is everything. Reflection. History often records what is loud: explosions, speeches, declarations. The Battle of the Atlantic turned on something quieter, a reduction in noise measured not in decibels but in lives. Thomas Patrick Lawson did not command a ship. He did not fire a weapon. He did not appear in photographs. He noticed something others did not, and he refused to stop insisting that it mattered. In a war defined by sound, by engines, explosions, and alarms, one man's contribution was silence. London, Washington, Ottawa, 1946 to 1970s. When the war ended, the Atlantic did not give up its secrets easily. 4 years, the official histories focused on aircraft range, radar improvements, code breaking, and shipbuilding output. These were visible victories, measurable, impressive, and easy to explain. Sound was harder. The files relating to convoy acoustic signatures remained classified well into the post-war period. Naval planners were reluctant to advertise how close the Allies had come to defeat, or how vulnerable modern shipping still was. What had worked in 1943 would be studied quietly, without publicity. Within Admiralty technical summaries, the solution that helped break the wolfpacks was referred to in sterile language: passive vibration attenuation via liquid mass isolation. No names attached. No origin story. But engineers remembered. In Britain, the United States, and Canada, naval architects began to incorporate vibration isolation as a fundamental principle of ship design. Engines were mounted on dampened beds. Shafts were isolated from hull frames. Liquid-filled tanks were positioned deliberately, not for ballast but for silence. These were not revolutionary changes. They were refinements, incremental, methodical, almost invisible. That was the point. Lessons carried forward. Cold War submarines would later take the concept much further. Nuclear boats would float their entire propulsion systems on rafts isolated from pressure hulls. Pumps would be redesigned to eliminate tonal noise. Even crew movements would be regulated. The idea that had once sounded insane, putting water inside a ship to make it quieter, became orthodoxy. Naval training manuals would eventually phrase it simply: the ocean rewards silence. None of those manuals mentioned Thomas Lawson. Lawson in later years. Lawson never sought recognition. In the 1950s, he declined an invitation from a naval research office to be interviewed formally. According to the clerk who recorded the exchange, Lawson said only, "I already told the man who needed to hear it." He lived quietly. He worked steadily. He raised children who knew little about his time at sea. In 1968, when the Merchant Marine was finally granted limited veteran status for World War II service, Lawson filled out the paperwork without comment. On the line asking for notable wartime contribution, he wrote none. He died in 1979, his passing noted in a local paper with a single line about wartime service. The view from history. By the late 20th century, historians examining declassified convoy data noticed something peculiar. The dramatic shift in shipping loss rates in May 1943 could not be explained by air coverage alone. The numbers did not align. It was only when acoustic research files were cross-referenced that the pattern emerged. The ships had gone quiet. Not all at once. Not everywhere. But enough. Enough to force submarines closer. Enough to bring them into range. Enough to turn the tide. Reflection. The Battle of the Atlantic is often remembered as a contest of machines. Ships versus submarines, sonar versus stealth. But machines are built and used by people, and progress often begins with attention rather than brilliance. Thomas Lawson did not solve a theoretical problem. He noticed a practical one. He listened when a ship died. He listened when no one else did. And because of that, thousands of men crossed an ocean that might otherwise have taken them. The final months of the war passed with the Atlantic gradually becoming less of a battlefield. Convoys sailed with fewer losses, U-boats increasingly hunted by escorts and aircraft, their numbers decimated. The lessons of 1943 had become standard practice. vibration isolation, liquid acoustic dampening, and careful attention to every noise a ship made. The tide of the war had turned quietly, without fanfare, and without most of the world ever realizing how close Britain had come to collapse. Thomas Patrick Lawson returned to his ordinary life. He cooked meals in a small Boston hospital, raised a family, and lived among neighbors who never suspected that the quiet, unassuming man who served scrambled eggs for 50 people had played a decisive role in one of the largest battles of the Second World War. His name was largely absent from official histories, hidden in classified reports that would only emerge decades later. His contribution, observing, listening, and daring to act, was understated but profound. Historians examining the convoy records after declassification recognized the pattern immediately. Ships modified with Lawson's methods survived while others fell. Convoy on 184 and subsequent crossings provided concrete evidence that altering the transmission of mechanical vibrations through water could reduce detection by as much as 97%. This forced U-boats to close dangerously near escorts, changing tactics, and ultimately turning the hunters into prey. Black May was not just a statistical anomaly, it was a turning point, made possible by observation, intuition, and courage unbound by rank or title. The human side of the story remained just as important as the tactical. Crewmen aboard the newly modified ships felt the difference. The engine rooms no longer rumbled relentlessly beneath their feet, the constant stress of vibration lessened, and for the first time, many could speak to one another without shouting over the machinery. They survived, often unaware why. Thousands of men would owe their lives to a man who had been dismissed as just a cook, a man who listened when others assumed they already had all the answers. In the decades following the war, naval engineers carried forward the principles Lawson had demonstrated. Nuclear submarines, modern destroyers, and escort vessels incorporated acoustic dampening in more sophisticated forms. The idea that water could absorb and mask the vibrations of machinery became a cornerstone of naval stealth technology. The principle was simple. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is survival. Thomas Lawson never sought fame. He never wrote memoirs, nor did he lobby for medals. He lived quietly, his legacy hidden in the statistics of survival and in naval engineering doctrines that would shape future generations. Those who study the Battle of the Atlantic recognize that while radar, sonar, and air power were decisive, the smallest details often made the difference between life and death. The story of the cook who saved thousands is a reminder that history is shaped not only by generals, admirals, and machines, but also by those who pay attention when everyone else is too busy following procedure, by those willing to act on observation and intuition, by those who refuse to accept that what seems impossible must be impossible. In the end, the Atlantic was won not through brute force alone, but through listening, understanding, and daring to change the rules quietly, effectively, and with courage that would remain invisible to most of the world. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War, turned on something quieter than guns, bombs, or propaganda. It turned on observation, patience, and a single man's insight. Thomas Patrick Lawson's quiet revolution in the engine rooms of merchant ships ensured that thousands lived, supplies reached Britain, and the course of the war, measured in both lives and tonnage, was irrevocably altered. History remembered the losses, the tactics, the battles, and the statistics, but buried deep within the numbers was the story of a cook who had listened, and whose silence became the loudest weapon of all. Though often overlooked, the final months of the Battle of the Atlantic solidified the quiet revolution that had begun in 1943. Convoys continued to sail across the North Atlantic under constant threat, but the combination of air cover, escort carriers, radar, and, most critically, the acoustic dampening innovations quietly implemented by Thomas Patrick Lawson, had transformed the ocean from a hunting ground for German U-boats into a gauntlet for the hunters themselves. By late 1944, Allied shipping loss rates were at levels previously considered impossible, and the Atlantic became a corridor of relative safety, allowing the continuous flow of food, fuel, and military supplies essential for sustaining the war effort in Europe. Lawson himself continued to live a life of quiet anonymity. After leaving the Merchant Marine in 1946, he returned to Boston and resumed civilian life. He married, raised children, and worked as a cook, quietly carrying the knowledge of his wartime contributions. Friends and neighbors knew him only as a hard-working, unassuming man who could make an excellent breakfast for dozens. His wartime actions were recorded only in obscure Admiralty reports and technical manuals, never celebrated in public. When asked about his service, he often replied simply, "I did what I could," never seeking recognition or reward. The men who had sailed under his influence remembered differently. In interviews years later, surviving merchant mariners often spoke of the quiet ships, the vessels that somehow seemed to slip through the ocean unnoticed. They recalled engine rooms that no longer rattled and convoys that made it through the North Atlantic without incident. Many of the sailors credited luck or good timing, unaware that their survival had hinged on one man's observation and ingenuity. Over 4,200 men who might have perished in the carnage of the Atlantic instead returned home safely, their lives directly shaped by a principle so simple it seemed absurd. Water absorbs vibration. The strategic consequences were enormous. The Allies could maintain a steady supply chain to Britain and later to liberated Europe after D-Day. U-boats, once the terror of the seas, could no longer operate with impunity. Black May of 1943 had been the turning point, but the implementation of acoustic dampening ensured that the advantage gained would be sustained for the remainder of the war. Submarine tactics were forced to evolve, and many of Germany's best commanders were lost in the process. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical. Commanders who had once relied on distant detection now had to close to dangerous proximity, facing depth charges, radar, and aircraft at every turn. Naval engineering itself was transformed. The lessons learned from Lawson's improvised experiments, liquid acoustic dampening, vibration isolation, and attention to subtle mechanical noise, became fundamental principles in ship design. During the Cold War, these ideas evolved into the sophisticated stealth technologies used in submarines and surface vessels. Ships that were quieter, less detectable, and more survivable could operate with confidence in hostile waters. The underlying concept remained the same: sound is survival and silence is a weapon. Lawson's story, preserved only in classified documents and later declassified technical reports, underscores the profound impact one individual can have even in a war dominated by industrial might, technological innovation, and strategic genius. He was neither an officer nor an engineer, yet his observations and determination provided a decisive advantage. It was not brilliance alone that turned the tide, it was the willingness to act on insight, the courage to challenge accepted thinking, and the patience to listen when others had stopped paying attention. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Atlantic had been won, not with overwhelming firepower, but through subtlety, ingenuity, and the careful application of science in the hands of a single, determined man. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the war, measured in months, thousands of miles, and countless lives. Yet hidden within the statistics was the story of Thomas Patrick Lawson, a cook whose insistence on listening, observing, and acting changed the course of the campaign. Today, when historians recount the victories of the Second World War, they often emphasize aircraft, tanks, and battles on land and in the air. But the story of the Atlantic reminds us that wars are won not only by the loud and the visible but also by the quiet, the overlooked, and the perceptive. The survival of thousands, the safeguarding of vital supply lines, and the eventual victory in Europe were in no small part due to a man who understood that silence, applied wisely, could be as powerful as any weapon. Thomas Patrick Lawson passed away in 1979, largely unheralded, his contributions buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and classified reports. Yet the lives he saved, the strategies he influenced, and the principle he proved continue to resonate. His story is a testament to the impact of human observation, courage, and ingenuity, and a reminder that even in the vast machinery of war, one person's insight can echo across oceans, altering the course of history itself. The Battle of the Atlantic had been decided not by the roar of guns, but by the quiet of water, the attentiveness of a single man, and the courage to act when no one else would. History remembers the losses, the tactics, and the heroes in uniform, but hidden within the numbers is the enduring legacy of a cook who saved thousands, proving that sometimes the most decisive weapon of all is simply listening.